My girlfriend made fun of me for not having enough money at her big party, so I stayed quiet. Those words rang out across the fancy rooftop as she held the microphone, looking at him like he was a mistake in front of everyone. He stood still, hearing the laughter fade away, feeling his face get hot while his hands stayed cold. Nobody knew he hadn't come here to beg her to love him, but to end things the right way. Just one short phone call, one strange person showing up, and the whole party changed completely within minutes. The next morning, the first person to get in trouble wasn't him. Before we continue, do me a favor. Click subscribe so you'll catch every update. If you're feeling excited about this story, hit like and comment where you're watching from, Boston, New York, or maybe Los Angeles. Alright, let's see how Jake handles this embarrassment. Jake Martinez fixed his simple black suit jacket as he walked onto the rooftop deck of the Sterling, downtown Atlanta's fanciest place for parties. Beautiful crystal lights hung from the ceiling, casting a warm glow across shiny marble floors, while the city skyline sparkled beyond huge windows that went from floor to ceiling. Emma Johnson stood in the center of it all, looking absolutely stunning in her bright green designer dress, accepting congratulations from coworkers and important business people who'd gathered to celebrate her big promotion to senior marketing director. Her laughter sounded like music floating through the air, and for a moment, Jake remembered why he'd fallen for her 8 months ago. Her energy was contagious and made everyone around her happy. The crowd of executives, business partners, and famous clients created the perfect background for her moment of success. He stayed at the edge of the party, watching everyone carefully. Emma moved through the room with practiced grace, her natural charm drawing people to her like a magnet. She'd worked really hard for this promotion, and Jake honestly felt proud watching her shine. When she looked his way, he gave her a supportive nod, noticing how her smile wobbled slightly before she turned back to her fans. The small change didn't escape his notice. Nothing ever did. Jake had learned a long time ago that the most important information came from what people didn't say, didn't do, and didn't admit. He touched his left wrist without thinking, feeling the familiar weight of his grandfather's old watch hidden beneath his shirt cuff. The microphone made a loud squealing sound briefly as Emma tapped it, getting everyone's attention. "Thank you all for being here tonight," she began, her voice confident and clear. "This promotion means everything to me, and having so many important people here to celebrate makes it even more special." Jake smiled, expecting the usual thank yous and professional speeches. But then Emma's eyes found his across the room, and something cold appeared in her expression. "You know, success means different things to different people," she continued. "Some people here tonight aren't quite in my financial league, but hey." She paused, letting the words hang in the air like smoke. "Love doesn't always follow money, right, Jake?" The laughter that followed felt sharp and uncomfortable. Jake felt every eye in the room turn toward him, looking at him, judging him, finding him not good enough in his cheap store-bought suit. Heat crawled up his neck, but his hands stayed steady, cold as winter. He didn't flinch, didn't look away, didn't offer the defensive explanation that Emma and everyone else clearly expected. Instead, he simply met her gaze and gave a single slow nod that somehow felt more dangerous than any angry outburst could have been. The silence that followed lasted exactly 3 seconds too long, filled with tension that made several guests shift uncomfortably. Jake turned and walked toward the deck doors with measured steps, each footstep careful and controlled. Behind him, he heard Emma's nervous laughter as she tried to lighten the mood, her voice slightly higher than before. The crowd's murmur started again, but quieter now. Uncertain. As he reached the outdoor deck, his phone buzzed against his chest. He answered without looking at the screen, already knowing who it would be. "Mr. Martinez?" The voice was professional and respectful, totally different from what he'd just experienced inside. "Your car will be ready in 20 minutes, sir. The usual entrance." Jake glanced back through the glass at the party continuing behind him, at Emma still talking to everyone but stealing worried glances in his direction. "Make it the VIP entrance tonight," he said quietly, then ended the call. 8 months earlier, Jake had walked into Grind Coffee on Peachtree Street wearing a faded Georgia Tech t-shirt and jeans with a small hole near the left knee. He'd deliberately chosen the cafe 3 blocks from Emma's marketing company, knowing the lunch crowd would include ambitious professionals like her. She sat alone at a corner table, scrolling through her phone while picking at a salad, her navy jacket draped over the chair back. When their eyes met across the crowded space, her smile was genuine and open, nothing like the calculated expression he'd witnessed tonight. He'd approached with coffee-stained sneakers squeaking against the polished floor, introducing himself simply as someone who worked in tech consulting. That first conversation flowed easily, touching on everything from her favorite podcasts to weekend hiking spots. But he noticed how her questions gradually shifted toward more practical things. By their third date, Emma's questions had developed a pattern. She'd asked about his apartment. "Do you rent or own?" while looking at his basic Honda Civic with poorly hidden disappointment. She wondered aloud about his career plans, his savings, his 5-year plan, always framing the questions as just wanting to get to know him better. Jake answered vaguely, mentioning contract work and freelance projects, watching her expression tighten with each unclear response. He'd made a conscious decision to live simply, driving the same reliable car he'd had since college, wearing simple clothes, avoiding any display of the wealth that had shaped his entire life. It wasn't lying exactly. It was more like an experiment to discover who people really were when they believed he had nothing to offer but himself. Amanda Williams, Emma's closest friend and self-appointed advisor, had started dropping hints during their first group dinner. "Girl, you need to think about compatibility," she'd said while examining Jake across the table at a trendy restaurant. "I'm not saying money is everything, but financial goals matter in a relationship." Jake had said nothing, cutting his steak while Amanda continued her subtle questioning about his career and family background. Emma had laughed nervously, changing the subject. But Jake caught the way she studied his reaction, measuring his silence for signs of insecurity or hidden anger. The dynamic established itself that night. Amanda would push, Emma would pull back slightly, and Jake would remain mysteriously unbothered by their obvious attempts to figure out what he was worth. The attacks had gotten worse gradually over the following months. Amanda commenting on his old Honda with air quotes and barely hidden laughter. Emma suggesting they split the bill at expensive restaurants, then joking about his tight budget when he agreed without complaint. Friends asking pointed questions about where he lived, his career advancement, his lack of obvious material goals. Jake absorbed each small insult with the patience of someone conducting a long-term study, cataloging every assumption, every dismissive glance, every coded comment about standards and leagues. He began to understand that they weren't just questioning his bank account, they were questioning his value as a human being, reducing him to a number on a paycheck. The promotion party invitation had arrived 3 weeks ago, fancy cardstock requesting his presence at an evening of celebration at the Sterling rooftop. Jake had studied the address twice, a quiet smile playing at his lips. Of all the venues in Atlanta, Emma had chosen to celebrate her success at the crown jewel of Martinez Holdings' real estate empire. The irony felt almost scripted, as if the universe itself was setting the stage for this moment. He'd confirmed his attendance immediately, with genuine anticipation. Tonight would mark the end of his 8-month experiment in human nature, and he couldn't think of a more appropriate setting for the final reveal. The invitation sat on his desk now, a cream-colored reminder that sometimes the most important tests happened in the places where you already held all the answers. The pattern had become impossible to miss over the past few weeks. When Emma introduced Jake at professional gatherings, she'd smile brightly and say, "This is Jake. He works in tech," then immediately turn to discussing someone else's impressive career or recent promotion. The introduction carried just enough information to avoid being rude while revealing nothing important, like describing a fancy car as simply having 4 wheels. Jake watched colleagues' interest disappear in real time as they processed the vague description, their polite nods shifting into that particular brand of dismissive courtesy reserved for people deemed professionally unimportant. Emma had perfected the art of keeping him at a distance without appearing mean, creating an invisible barrier that kept him separate from her rising world. Last Tuesday at a fancy clothing store, she'd spotted a designer shirt in the window and pulled him inside to browse. The salesperson, a polished man in his 50s, had approached with practiced enthusiasm until Emma mentioned they were just looking, with a meaningful glance at Jake's department store khakis. "That piece is $300, the man had said, his tone shifting almost unnoticeably cooler. "Probably not quite what you're shopping for." Emma had laughed, touching Jake's arm with fake sympathy. "That's like his whole paycheck, right, baby?" The joke landed with surgical precision, embarrassing him while positioning herself as the generous partner slumming it with someone beneath her level. Jake had simply nodded, filing away yet another piece of evidence in his growing collection of casual cruelties disguised as affection. Amanda's commentary had grown bolder with each social gathering, her observations delivered with the confidence of someone who believed she was stating obvious truths. At dinner parties, she'd ask Jake about his investment strategy while wearing the expression of a teacher quizzing a struggling student. "You do have a retirement plan, right?" she'd ask, then turn to the table with theatrical concern. "Emma's going to have to plan for both of them." The other guests would chuckle uncomfortably while Emma protested weakly, her objections lacking any real conviction. Jake recognized the performance for what it was, a public positioning exercise designed to establish hierarchies and reinforce Emma's status as the financially responsible partner carrying dead weight. The comments about his appearance had evolved into a sophisticated system of coded put-downs. His watch, a family heirloom worth more than most people's cars, was consistently described as classic or timeless, code words that everyone understood meant cheap and outdated. His shoes, handcrafted Italian leather that cost more than a mortgage payment, drew observations about practical choices and budget-conscious shopping. The Honda Civic became a running joke, with Amanda suggesting Emma deserved someone who could upgrade his transportation situation, along with his career prospects. Each insult was wrapped in enough fake concern to maintain social acceptability while delivering maximum psychological damage. During their shopping trip last weekend, the final piece of evidence had fallen into place. Emma had been browsing designer handbags when an elderly woman approached Jake with obvious recognition. "Excuse me, aren't you?" she'd begun. But Jake had smoothly redirected the conversation, introducing himself simply as Jake and deflecting her questions with practiced ease. The woman had looked confused but dropped the subject, while Emma remained completely unaware of the exchange, focused entirely on calculating which purse would make the best impression at upcoming work events. In that moment, Jake understood that she truly saw him only through the lens of her own ambitions, unable to perceive anything that didn't directly relate to her social and professional climbing. The experiment was nearly complete, and tonight would provide the final definitive results. All that remained was choosing the perfect moment for the reveal that would change everything between them forever. The Sterling's rooftop deck buzzed with Atlanta's business elite, their conversations creating a sophisticated hum beneath the smooth jazz flowing from hidden speakers. Jake moved through clusters of executives and their partners, recognizing faces from business magazines and newspapers. The guest list read like a who's who of the city's power structure, senior partners from major law firms, real estate moguls, tech company CEOs, and the kind of old money families who appeared at charity galas and museum board meetings. Emma had positioned herself strategically near the main bar, where a steady stream of well-wishers could approach with champagne glasses and business cards, each interaction carefully designed to maximize her visibility among the city's most influential professionals. The dress code spoke its own language of exclusion and belonging. Men wore custom-tailored suits that cost more than most people's monthly salary, their Swiss watches catching light as they gestured with crystal glasses. Women displayed understated elegance that only came from personal stylists and unlimited shopping budgets, their jewelry whispering stories of generational wealth and careful investment. Jake's store-bought suit marked him immediately as an outsider, drawing subtle glances and barely concealed assessments from people who'd spent decades learning to categorize others by their accessories. He felt their evaluation like a physical weight, each dismissive look confirming his status as Emma's mysterious +1 rather than an equal participant in their exclusive social world. Amanda materialized beside him with predatory timing, her silver cocktail dress catching the overhead lighting as she surveyed the crowd with obvious satisfaction. This is exactly the kind of networking Emma needs, she announced, gesturing toward a group of pharmaceutical executives laughing near the champagne fountain. Real connections with serious people who can open doors. She turned to Jake with that familiar expression of calculated concern, her voice dropping to what she imagined was a confidential tone. Speaking of futures, have you thought about your retirement planning? I mean, Emma's going to be making serious money now, but she'll need a partner who can contribute equally to their long-term financial goals. The question hung in the air like smoke, designed to provoke either defensive explanations or embarrassed admissions of inadequacy. The interrogation expanded as more of Emma's colleagues joined the conversation, their questions forming a coordinated assault on Jake's perceived financial vulnerability. "What neighborhood are you looking at for your next place?" asked Eric from accounts, his tone suggesting he already knew the answer would be disappointing. "Any thoughts on diversifying your investment portfolio?" contributed Sarah from legal, her smile sharp enough to cut glass. "Emma mentioned you're still driving that Honda. Have you considered upgrading to something more professional?" Each question felt designed to expose his limitations while reinforcing their assumption that he existed on the margins of their successful world, tolerated rather than respected. Jake sipped his drink and absorbed each verbal jab with the patience of someone who understood the game being played around him. He watched Emma across the room, noting how she glowed under the attention, while stealing nervous glances in his direction. She clearly wanted him to defend himself, to offer explanations that would justify his presence in her elevated social circle. Instead, he simply nodded at appropriate intervals, his silence creating an uncomfortable vacuum that his interrogators tried to fill with increasingly pointed observations about financial responsibility and career advancement. The beautiful irony wasn't lost on him. They were holding their celebration of success in a building he owned, questioning his worth while drinking champagne he could afford to buy by the case. Emma approached with purposeful strides, champagne glass in one hand and microphone in the other. Her expression mixing triumph with something that looked suspiciously like determination. The crowd began turning toward her, sensing the main event was about to begin, conversations trailing off as anticipation filled the elegant space. Jake felt his phone buzz against his chest but ignored it, focusing entirely on Emma's face as she prepared to address the assembled crowd. Whatever happened next would determine the trajectory of both their futures, and he found himself curious about which version of herself she would choose to reveal. The microphone squealed briefly as Emma adjusted it, her emerald dress shimmering under the crystal lights as conversations gradually died throughout the rooftop deck. She stood at the center of the elegant space, champagne glass raised, radiating the confidence of someone who'd finally claimed her rightful place among Atlanta's business elite. "Thank you all for being here tonight to celebrate this incredible milestone with me," she began, her voice carrying clearly across the marble floors and soaring windows. "This promotion represents everything I've worked for, and having so many distinguished guests here makes this moment absolutely perfect." Jake watched from the edge of the crowd, noting how naturally she commanded attention, how effortlessly she embodied the success she'd always craved. For a moment, he remembered the woman who'd laughed at his terrible jokes during those first coffee dates, before ambition had hardened into something colder and more brittle. The gratitude portion of her speech flowed smoothly, hitting all the expected notes about teamwork, mentorship, and corporate values while name-dropping the senior partners and major clients scattered throughout the audience. Emma had clearly rehearsed these remarks, each pause calculated for maximum impact, each acknowledgement strategically designed to reinforce her new position in the company hierarchy. But then something shifted in her expression, a subtle hardening around her eyes that Jake recognized from their recent arguments about career priorities and financial compatibility. She turned slightly, her gaze finding his across the crowded space, and he realized with crystal clear clarity that her real message tonight wasn't about gratitude. It was about establishing permanent boundaries between her ascending world and anyone who might drag her back down. "You know," Emma continued, her tone shifting from gracious to conversational, "success really does mean different things to different people, doesn't it?" A few guests nodded politely, assuming she was building towards some inspirational conclusion about diverse paths to achievement. I've learned that it's important to surround yourself with people who share your ambitions, your drive, your commitment to excellence. Her eyes locked onto Jake with laser precision, and he felt the room's attention beginning to shift in his direction like a spotlight slowly swinging toward its target. Some people here tonight aren't quite in my financial league, she said, letting each word drop like a stone into still water. But hey, love doesn't always follow money, right, Jake? The laughter that erupted felt like a physical blow, sharp and cruel, and exactly what Emma had intended. Jake felt 50 pairs of eyes swivel toward him, measuring him against the woman who just publicly categorized him as charity work rather than an equal partner. Heat crawled up his neck while his hands turned to ice, every muscle in his body demanding that he flee or fight or defend himself with the fury of someone who'd been humiliated in front of strangers. Instead, he remained perfectly still, his expression unchanged, meeting Emma's gaze with the kind of calm that felt more dangerous than any explosive reaction. The silence stretched for exactly 3 heartbeats too long, charged with tension that made several guests shift uncomfortably, suddenly aware they'd witnessed something more brutal than a simple joke. Amanda's voice cut through the uncomfortable quiet like a blade. "That's so generous of you, Emma," she said with theatrical admiration, her words designed to drive the knife deeper while maintaining plausible deniability. "Not everyone would be so understanding about differences in ambition." The comment landed perfectly, providing cover for Emma's cruelty while reinforcing the narrative that Jake was dead weight she'd charitably chosen to carry. More laughter followed, nervous but genuine, as the crowd processed what they'd just witnessed, a public execution disguised as affectionate teasing. Jake absorbed every chuckle, every exchanged glance, every moment of second-hand embarrassment that confirmed his worst suspicions about the woman he'd thought he loved. He reached into his jacket pocket with deliberate slowness, retrieving his phone and typing a single message without breaking eye contact with Emma. Her smile faltered slightly as she watched him, perhaps sensing that his reaction, or lack thereof, wasn't following the script she'd imagined. The response came immediately, lighting up his screen. *7:45 p.m. sharp, sir. Everything is prepared. Jake slipped the phone back into his pocket and gave Emma one final nod, this one carrying a weight that made her champagne glass tremble almost unnoticeably in her manicured fingers. In exactly 18 minutes, her carefully constructed evening would collapse in ways she couldn't yet imagine. Jake stepped through the glass doors onto the outdoor deck section, the cool Atlanta night air hitting his face like a blessing after the suffocating atmosphere inside. The city lights stretched below him in all directions, a familiar view that had comforted him since childhood visits to this very building with his grandfather. He could still hear the party continuing behind the floor-to-ceiling windows, Emma's nervous laughter as she tried to recapture the celebratory mood, the resumption of conversations that carried an undertone of excitement about the drama they'd just witnessed. His hands had stopped trembling, though whether from cold or adrenaline he couldn't say. The heat in his chest remained, a steady burn that reminded him of every microaggression he'd endured over 8 months of careful observation and silent documentation. 2 executives from Emma's firm wandered past on their way to the bar, their voices carrying in the crisp air. "Smart move, stepping away like that," one said with obvious approval. "Shows class when someone knows their place." His companion chuckled, swirling bourbon in his crystal glass. "She really called him out, though. Takes guts to be that direct about financial compatibility." Jake absorbed their commentary like data points, adding them to his mental catalog of human behavior under social pressure. They saw his retreat as submission rather than strategy, his silence as shame rather than patience. In 14 minutes, their comfortable assumptions about power dynamics and social hierarchies would receive a correction they'd never forget. The private elevator bank stood 20 feet away, its brushed steel doors bearing a discreet plaque, Executive Access Martinez Holdings. Jake had never used those elevators in Emma's presence, always opting for the main lifts that served the building's commercial tenants and restaurant guests. Tonight, for the first time in 8 months, he positioned himself with a clear view of both the VIP entrance and the party behind the glass. The irony of location had been too perfect to resist, Emma celebrating her corporate ascension in the crown jewel of his family's real estate empire, questioning his worth while standing on property he'd inherited before they'd even met. The universe seemed determined to script this confrontation with maximum symbolic impact. Security personnel moved through the space with practiced invisibility, their presence noticed only when someone needed directions or assistance. Jake recognized several faces from years of family events and business meetings, men and women who'd watched him grow up in these elegant spaces. They maintained perfect professional distance tonight, treating him like any other guest as he'd specifically requested. But he caught the subtle signs of recognition, a respectful nod from the head of security, a slightly deeper bow from the concierge, the way conversations paused when he passed. In 11 minutes, that careful facade would drop completely, and everyone present would understand exactly who they'd been dismissing all evening. Another wave of guests emerged onto the deck, their laughter carrying hints of the gossip already beginning to circulate inside. "Did you see his face?" a woman in designer jewelry whispered to her companion. "I almost felt bad for him." Her friend adjusted her expensive clutch with practiced elegance. "Emma's better off knowing the truth. No point pretending financial differences don't matter in serious relationships." Jake checked his watch, the real one, not the fictional budget timepiece everyone assumed he wore, and calculated exactly 8 minutes until his life would split definitively into before and after. Behind the glass, Emma moved through her admirers with renewed confidence, apparently believing his absence confirmed her narrative about knowing one's proper place in social hierarchies. The soft chime of the private elevator arriving echoed across the deck, barely audible above the ambient music and conversation. Jake turned toward the sound, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth as he prepared to step back into the party that was about to become something entirely different. In 7 minutes, Emma Johnson would learn the difference between assumptions and reality, between perceived power and actual influence, between thinking you know someone and discovering you never knew them at all. The executive elevator doors opened with whisper-quiet precision, revealing Margaret Stevens in an impeccably tailored charcoal suit. Her silver hair swept into a professional bun that spoke of decades managing high-stakes corporate affairs. She stepped onto the marble floor with the confidence of someone who'd orchestrated countless boardroom victories, a sleek tablet tucked under her left arm while her right hand adjusted the discreet Martinez Holdings pin on her lapel. Behind her, 2 junior executives in matching navy suits followed at respectful distances, their expressions serious and focused as they scanned the elegant party space. Margaret's eyes found Jake immediately, her face shifting from professional neutrality to warm recognition as she approached with purposeful strides that commanded attention from everyone in her path. "Mr. Martinez," she said clearly, her voice carrying across the deck with the kind of authority that made conversations pause mid-sentence. "I apologize for interrupting your evening, but the quarterly board materials are ready for your final review." She extended the tablet toward him with both hands, the gesture containing enough respect to make several nearby guests look up from their drinks with sudden interest. The device's screen displayed the unmistakable Martinez Holdings logo, a stylized M that matched the building directory, the elevator plaques, and the discreet signage that marked this property as the crown jewel of Atlanta's most successful real estate empire. "The Singapore acquisition documents require your signature before tomorrow's international call," Margaret continued. The transformation in the room's atmosphere was instantaneous and absolute. Conversations died midword as 50 guests processed what they were witnessing, their champagne glasses frozen halfway to their lips while their minds struggled to reconcile the Jake they'd been dismissing with the man being addressed as Mr. Martinez by executives who radiated serious money and corporate power. The head of security approached with visible respect, speaking in low tones about vehicle arrangements and scheduling conflicts. A member of the building's management team appeared as if from thin air, tablet in hand, requesting guidance on a tenant dispute that required ownership-level intervention. The carefully choreographed evening Emma had planned suddenly belonged to someone else entirely. Jake accepted the tablet with casual familiarity, his fingers moving across the screen with the ease of someone who'd been reviewing such documents since childhood. "Cancel the Singapore call," he said quietly, his voice carrying new weight now that everyone understood exactly who was speaking. "Push the acquisition timeline back 2 weeks. I want updated environmental impact assessments before we proceed. Margaret nodded, making notes on a second device, while the junior executives flanked them like a protective detail. The building's general manager materialized beside the security chief, both men waiting patiently for instructions from the man they'd been serving discreetly all evening. And Margaret, Jake continued, not bothering to lower his voice, please have legal review our current tenant agreements. Some relationships may need adjustment. Emma stood frozen behind the glass doors, champagne glass trembling in her manicured fingers as the reality of her situation crashed over her like ice water. Her face had gone pale beneath her carefully applied makeup, her emerald dress suddenly seeming too bright, too celebratory for what was unfolding before her eyes. Amanda appeared at her shoulder, mouth slightly open, her usual confidence replaced by dawning horror, as she recognized the magnitude of their miscalculation. The party guests stared openly now, no longer pretending to maintain polite conversations while something extraordinary happened 20 feet away. Several people had already begun pulling out phones, sensing that whatever they were witnessing would become the kind of story people told for years. Jake handed the tablet back to Margaret, then turned to face the glass wall where Emma and her guests pressed against the windows like spectators at an aquarium. Thank you for the lovely speech about leagues, Miss Johnson, he said, his voice pitched to carry clearly through the open deck doors. I do hope your promotion works out well for you. He straightened his jacket, the same store-bought suit they'd mocked all evening, and walked toward the executive elevator with Margaret and her team flanking him like an honor guard. The doors closed with final-sounding precision, leaving behind a room full of people who suddenly understood they'd spent the evening watching a masterclass in quiet power, strategic patience, and the kind of revenge that required no violence, no cruelty, only perfect timing and unshakable dignity. The video appeared on social media at 11:47 that night, posted by Derek from accounts with the caption, "When you realize exactly who you just disrespected at a party." By morning, it had been shared across every major platform, accumulating views and comments at exponential rates as Atlanta's business community woke up to discover they'd missed the most spectacular social reversal in recent memory. The footage captured everything with crystal clarity: Emma's public humiliation of Jake, his eerily calm response, and then Margaret Stevens' arrival with the tablet displaying the Martinez Holdings logo. Professional networks buzzed with analysis and commentary, while local news outlets picked up the story as an example of how assumptions about wealth and status could lead to spectacular miscalculations in the city's interconnected business ecosystem. LinkedIn became ground zero for the fallout, with Emma's profile attracting hundreds of comments ranging from professional concern to barely concealed schadenfreude. Her company's partners began fielding calls from clients and colleagues who'd seen the viral footage, asking pointed questions about employee conduct and corporate values. The marketing director who'd celebrated her promotion less than 24 hours earlier now found herself summoned to emergency meetings with human resources and senior leadership, her professional reputation suddenly requiring damage control efforts that threatened to overshadow her recent achievements. Her phone buzzed constantly with notifications, friend requests from strangers and interview requests from business journalists who smelled blood in the water. Amanda's attempts at damage control only made the situation worse, her social media posts trying to contextualize the evening's events while inadvertently revealing more details about their systematic campaign to humiliate Jake over the preceding months. Screenshots of her comments about leagues and financial compatibility circulated alongside the original video, creating a comprehensive record of their behavior that painted them both in an increasingly unflattering light. Professional contacts who'd known Amanda for years began distancing themselves, canceling lunch meetings and networking events, while her own employer received inquiries about whether her public conduct reflected company values. The digital pile-on took on a life of its own, with strangers dissecting every aspect of their behavior and finding them wanting. Jake's phone remained conspicuously silent throughout the morning, his assistant fielding all calls and directing inquiries to the appropriate Martinez Holdings departments. He spent the day in his penthouse office reviewing quarterly reports and acquisition proposals while the city's business community processed the revelation of his true identity. Occasional updates from Margaret kept him informed about the viral video's reach and the various requests for interviews, comments, and clarifications that were flooding their communications department. He declined them all, understanding that silence would be far more powerful than any public statement he could make. The story would write itself without his participation, and his dignity would remain intact while others scrambled to explain their behavior. By afternoon, the ripple effects had spread through Atlanta's interconnected professional networks like cracks in glass. Companies that did business with Martinez Holdings began quietly reviewing their relationships with Emma's firm, asking uncomfortable questions about employee conduct and professional standards. Several major clients expressed concerns about associating their brands with the kind of public humiliation that had dominated social media feeds all morning. Partnership opportunities that had seemed certain began evaporating as decision-makers reconsidered whether they wanted to work with someone who displayed such poor judgment in such a public forum. The promotion that was supposed to launch Emma's career into the stratosphere had instead become the catalyst for its most serious professional crisis. Emma appeared in the Martinez Holdings lobby at 4:37 that afternoon, her designer dress replaced by a conservative business suit that suggested desperate attempts at damage control. Security cameras captured her conversation with the reception staff, her animated gestures and obvious distress contrasting sharply with the polite but firm responses she received. The receptionist's call to Jake's office was brief and professional. "There's a Miss Emma Johnson requesting to see you, sir. She says it's urgent and personal." Jake considered the request for exactly 10 seconds before responding. "Tell her I'll meet with her tomorrow at 10 a.m. Business hours only." The message would be clear enough. Whatever personal relationship they'd once shared was now a matter requiring formal scheduling and professional boundaries that she'd helped create through her own choices. The meeting room on the 32nd floor of Martinez Holdings commanded a panoramic view of Atlanta's skyline, floor-to-ceiling windows framing the city where Emma had built her career and Jake had quietly inherited an empire. She sat across from him at a polished conference table that probably cost more than her annual salary, her hands clasped tightly in her lap while her eyes darted between his face and the legal documents spread between them like evidence in a criminal trial. The woman who'd radiated confidence at her promotion party now appeared diminished, her usual poise replaced by the desperate energy of someone trying to salvage a situation that had already spiraled beyond repair. Jake had chosen this formal setting deliberately, neutral ground where their personal history held no weight against the reality of changed circumstances. "I need you to understand," Emma began, her voice smaller than he'd ever heard it. "I had no idea you were. I mean, if I had known about your family's wealth, about Martinez Holdings, I never would have said those things." Tears gathered in her eyes as she leaned forward, reaching toward his hands before stopping herself. "Baby, you have to believe me. I didn't know who you really were. If you had just told me the truth from the beginning, none of this would have happened." Her apology carried the desperate sincerity of someone who genuinely believed she was addressing the core issue. That revelation about his financial status would retroactively justify her behavior and restore their relationship to its previous state. Jake studied her face with the clinical interest of a researcher examining a particularly revealing specimen, noting how her distress centered entirely on her ignorance of his wealth rather than the cruelty of her actions. "Let me make sure I understand," he said quietly, his voice carrying none of the warmth she'd once taken for granted. "You're apologizing for not knowing I had money." The statement hung in the air like a challenge, precise and unforgiving in its clarity. "You haven't apologized for humiliating me in front of 50 people. You haven't apologized for 8 months of treating me like charity work. You're sorry you miscalculated my net worth." Each word landed with surgical precision, dissecting the fundamental flaw in her reasoning while she watched her carefully prepared speech crumble under the weight of its own moral bankruptcy. Emma's face flushed as she realized the trap her own words had created, her mouth opening and closing without sound as she struggled to find an explanation that didn't confirm his assessment of her character. "That's not... I mean, yes, but..." She took a shaky breath, trying to regain her composure. "Jake, baby, if you had just been honest with me from the start, we could have avoided all this misunderstanding. Why did you let me think you were struggling financially? Why didn't you trust me enough to tell me the truth about your family?" Her questions revealed the depth of her inability to comprehend the test she'd failed, her conviction that disclosure of his wealth would have changed her behavior, without recognizing that such change would have proven his point about her true nature. Jake reached into his briefcase and withdrew a leather portfolio, placing it on the table between them with the finality of a judge delivering a verdict. "This is a cease and desist order regarding any public statements about our relationship," he said, his tone shifting to pure business formality. "My legal team has prepared comprehensive documentation about defamation, harassment, and the potential impact of your behavior on Martinez Holdings' reputation." He opened the portfolio to reveal official letterhead and dense legal text that made Emma's face go pale. "Any future contact between us will be handled through appropriate legal channels." The woman who'd once shared his bed and his secrets was now being reduced to a potential litigation risk, their personal history sanitized into corporate liability management. Standing from his chair, Jake straightened his suit jacket, the same style she mocked for months, and delivered his final assessment with the quiet authority of someone who'd learned exactly who she was beneath her ambitious facade. "I tested your character, Emma. You tested my patience." The words carried 8 months of careful observation, systematic humiliation, and strategic silence transformed into a conclusion that left no room for negotiation or appeal. "The difference between us is that my test had a purpose." He walked toward the door without looking back, leaving her alone with legal documents and the devastating realization that some mistakes couldn't be apologized away, especially when they revealed truths about character that no amount of wealth could change or forgive. The announcement appeared in the Atlanta Business Chronicle 3 weeks later, buried in the corporate restructuring section where most people wouldn't notice its significance. Emma Johnson had been laterally transferred to the company's Nashville office, her title unchanged, but her responsibilities significantly reduced, effectively ending her partnership track and removing her from Atlanta's interconnected business ecosystem. Amanda Williams faced similar consequences, finding herself suddenly excluded from networking events and professional opportunities as her association with the viral incident made her a liability rather than an asset. The fallout had been swift but proportionate. Emma hadn't been destroyed, merely relocated to a position more appropriate for someone who'd revealed her true character under pressure. Jake read the news while reviewing acquisition reports in his penthouse office, feeling neither satisfaction nor vindication at the confirmation that actions carried consequences, even in Atlanta's forgiving business climate. The incident had served its purpose, providing a clear demonstration of how assumptions about power and worth could lead to spectacular miscalculations. But Jake felt no need to dwell on victories that had been inevitable from the moment he'd chosen to test her character. The viral video had already faded into the background noise of social media's endless cycle, and he'd moved on to other concerns that mattered more than temporary internet fame. Saturday morning found him at the Piedmont Park Farmers Market, examining heirloom tomatoes while chatting with vendors who treated every customer with genuine warmth, regardless of their appearance or presumed purchasing power. Dr. Alicia Chin appeared at the neighboring herb stand, her medical scrubs replaced by jeans and a Georgia Tech sweatshirt that suggested weekend plans focused on comfort rather than impression management. They'd been introduced at a children's hospital charity gala the previous weekend, their conversation ranging from cardiac surgery techniques to hiking trails without a single reference to financial portfolios or career advancement strategies. She approached with a smile that reached her eyes, asking his opinion about pasta recipes rather than his thoughts on investment opportunities. Their conversation over coffee revealed the kind of compatibility that couldn't be manufactured: shared interests in literature and travel, similar approaches to philanthropy, complementary perspectives on work-life balance. Alicia asked thoughtful questions about his experiences growing up in Atlanta, treating his family background as context rather than opportunity. When she mentioned her own student loans and residency struggles, she did so without shame or calculation, simply sharing her journey toward becoming the surgeon she'd always wanted to be. Jake found himself relaxing in ways he'd forgotten, remembering what authentic connection felt like when stripped of ulterior motives. As they walked through the park discussing weekend hiking plans, Jake's phone buzzed with a final message from Emma's number. "I know I hurt you, but losing everything wasn't fair. Some of us have to work for what we have. He read it once, then deleted it without responding, understanding that she still didn't comprehend the lesson their relationship had taught him. Alicia's laughter at his story about a particularly stubborn hospital administrator reminded him that the best connections were built on mutual respect rather than mutual benefit, and that sometimes the most valuable discoveries came from seeing who people really were when they thought no one important was watching.